Okay, so this training is going to be over just general sampling techniques. Most of the sampling we do is not super technical. It's just a matter of making sure that we're preserving our samples properly, they're getting to the lab quickly, and that you're sampling in a reasonable manner in terms of where you're choosing to sample and how many samples you take. So it's a good rule of thumb to carry in your truck, whether you're in sales or you're a tech or whatever you are, at least 3 sample jars, at least 3 sets of gloves, and an ice chest. And then another good rule of thumb is that if you dig, you need to sample. In most cases, if we excavate soil, you're going to need to do a background and confirmation sample at the very least. So when you're pulling a hot sample, we're just going to go through the general steps. Put on a fresh pair of gloves. You don't want to reuse gloves for your samples, so you should use a fresh pair for each sample you pull. So put on that fresh pair of gloves, and then using your gloved hands, scoop up some of the excavated soil and place it into the jar. Do not use the jar to scoop, because we can't guarantee that the jar's outside is free of contaminants. You could have had it in your truck and it's rolling around on the floor. You had oil on your shoes. Now we've got oil in the jar, and it just will screw up our hot sample. So use your glove, make sure it's clean. Once you've got that soil in the jar, take those gloves off and throw them away. And then in Zora, the only piece of information that we really need for your hot sample is the time that you took it. So in your Zora, make sure that the time is recorded that you took your hot sample. Then you'd go ahead and put that jar into the ice chest on ice. That's a big thing. Please make sure that you're putting your samples on ice. It's the most basic form of sample preservation. So, at the very least, please make sure you're putting your samples on ice. The next sample that we would pull after excavation would be the confirmation sample. Sometimes there can be 1, sometimes you could have 2, sometimes you could have 3 confirmation samples. You should be pulling a confirmation sample at least every 10 to 20 feet. So if you've dug, an area that's 80 feet long, it wouldn't do much good just to take 1 confirmation sample. You'd want to take multiple confirmation samples to really make sure that the area has been remediated. So that's why it's always good. The more jars you carry, the better. So once again, put on another pair of fresh gloves. Do not reuse the same gloves. Scoop up the soil in multiple locations, wherever you're pulling your confirmation sample. So you'll scoop up the soil using your gloved hand, not the jar. Take off those gloves and throw them away. Set the jar down where you sampled. So wherever you just pulled that sample, put the jar down on top. Take a picture of it. And record your coordinates and the time that you pulled the sample, and put all of this information into Zora. It's really important that you take your coordinates and that they're recorded, because if we're asked to go back and make a sampling map of where you pulled your samples and there's no information regarding where you actually pulled the sample, then there's no way for us to make a map. So please make sure you take your coordinates. You can do Google Maps or whatever on your phone. Just get some type of coordinates on there, along with a picture of it and the time that you took that sample. So you'll put that jar into the ice chest, and then if you're pulling multiple confirmation samples, then repeat this process over again using clean gloves each time. So this is a good example. I think this was Dan or Big Chris. They both do a really great job of documenting where they have pulled their samples. So you can see they put the sample jar down where they took the sample. They have the Zora, they have a C for confirmation. They've got the date on there and the time that they pulled it. And then they screenshot it and put this into Zora, which is awesome, the exact location of where these samples were taken. So it has the latitude, longitude, and the address. So that's super duper helpful for when we have to go back and make a sampling map. So for the background sample, once again, you'd put on a pair of fresh gloves. And when you're trying to figure out where you should pull your background sample, you have to remember that the goal is to pull from an area nearby that is as similar as possible to the impacted area, but that was not impacted by the spill, obviously. So if you're by the side of the road remediating the soil, you'd walk about 10 feet down the road and pull your soil upstream. You wouldn't want to pull it downstream where water could run. You'd want to pull it upstream of an impacted side of the roadway that's identical or similar to the spot impacted by the spill. This way, you've pulled a soil sample that is pretty much just like the spill site before the spill took place. You wouldn't want to walk 25 feet away from the road to a really nice, grassy, beautiful area like a field of flowers and pull your background sample there. That's not a representative sample of the soil directly next to the roadway. So just be smart about where you're pulling your sample. So once again, use your gloved hands, scoop up some of the, it should be clean soil. I don't know why it says excavated soil right there. So scoop up some of the clean soil for your background sample. Take off your gloves, throw them away. Do the same thing again where you set down the jar where you sampled, take a picture of it, take your coordinates, record the time, and put all of this into the Zora. And then like all the other samples, put that jar into the ice chest on ice. So this is kind of a good visual of how you'd look at and determine where you should pull your background sample. So once again, it should be representative of that area if it hadn't been impacted by the spill. So we've got that red area, it says the spill area. If the spill was over there, you'd want to walk down the road, 10, 20 feet, also by the side of the road, and pull from that gold star area. That would be a reasonable background sample. You wouldn't want to walk over here by this fence, and pull like right underneath the fence or whatever, where, it's an area that's not even remotely similar to the spill site. So once again, just be smart about where you pull your background sample, because, if you pull from a super clean area, we're going to have some pretty high standards in terms of remediation that we would have to keep digging and digging, trying to get it down to no TPH detected, when that's really not reasonable for the side of the road in most cases. So be smart about that. And once again, here's an example. This is background. They put the Zora on the jar and then what time they pulled it, and include the coordinates in the Zora. So, and the importance of ice. Please make sure you put your samples on ice and that they're delivered to the lab on ice. Do not deliver your samples to the lab just in an empty cooler. If, the cooler has sat overnight because you finished the job in the middle of the night, and you get, when you get to work the next morning to take the samples in and they're sitting in water, dump the water out, put some new ice in there. Because when you bring those samples to the lab, they're going to take the temperature. And if the temperature is super high, that can affect the, veracity of our samples, the legitimacy of them if they've been sitting in the heat all night. So that's something that you please make sure they're on ice. Additionally, the other big thing is they really need to be in the lab within 24 hours of pulling them. Do not be like, I'll pull these samples on Monday and I'll take them in, on Friday. That's too long. You don't want old samples. All of these things in terms of, making sure they're on ice, making sure you get them to the lab quickly. These are all things that customers look at when they look at our analytical. The state will look at that. And if they're seeing these things on our results that say, they didn't put their samples on ice. They didn't take their samples until, a week or two later. This all makes us look super unprofessional, like we don't know what we're doing. So please make sure that you guys are following these steps. Just promptly getting them to the lab, making sure they're on ice. And there's even sometimes when you're sampling weird stuff, maybe a chemical or a substance that we're not used to sampling periodically, it's always good to talk to the lab and say, hey, do I need some special jars for this? Sometimes they have special preservation within the jars. So it's always best to talk to waste, who can then talk to the lab and make sure that we're on point with pulling samples. But most samples are just our soil and diesel, so it should not be that hard if you follow these steps. Then last big piece is the chain of custody. Most of the time, I'll be filling these out. I know a lot of the other locations, your ops manager is filling these out. This has to accompany the samples. Basically, it gives all of the information about the samples that the lab could possibly need. It's really important that all parts of the chain of custody are filled out. You can see here, I've gone through and even crossed out boxes where I didn't need to fill the information in. But it's really important that all of this is on here. You've got the sample ID name. You've got the matrix, this WW, so it was wastewater, the date of the sample, the time of the sample, the number of jars, and then what analytical tests are being run. You can see there's that list. It says metals, TPH, RCI, which is for corrosives, and ignitability. Got TCLIP VOC. So there's just, it's really important that everything is completed on this chain of custody. It's just another something that adds to credibility, and veracity of the samples when someone's reviewing results. If this sucker's a fourth of the way filled out, then, that's just not professional. So make sure it's all filled out. And you can also see, if you look down at the bottom, it says, there's actually a spot where it says temperature. So see my mouse. Okay, so right here. So they take the temperature, and if these hadn't been brought in on ice, then that would have been super duper high, which could, affect the integrity of our samples. So really important. Make sure you change your gloves. Make sure you're taking down in your Zora the time you took the sample and the coordinates. please make sure you put your samples on ice and that they get to the lab within 24 hours. Do not let samples sit for a long time. So yeah, that's basically it. Just go ahead and look through the quiz, complete that, get that turned in, and then let me know if you have any questions.